Our first session this morning is really around some research that Apkudo is undergoing with FDM CCS Insight. Yesterday, we talked about the importance of trusted data from all of you and what it means for your business. And what we seek to uncover is what's important to the consumer. What are they trying to understand when they're shopping for refurbished and used devices? So we started with some focus groups. So Simon's going to share some of the early insights, and I welcome your feedback and conversation on some of the early observations we learned from the focus group. So, Simon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. Okay, excited to be sharing this research with you all. It's all very hot off the press. 2 weeks ago today, we were hosting focus groups in the US and in the UK. So it's all very recent. We've been analysing it last week and pulling these slides together. So what you're seeing is very, very fresh. So yeah, as Kristen highlighted, really we're trying to get a sense from consumers, this point about trust. You know, CCS Insight, FDM CCS Insight, we do a lot of consumer research. We do a lot of industry research, which I referred to yesterday. But there's no question that, you know, you look at the market data and you think, actually, shouldn't this market be growing a little bit more than it is? And as I mentioned yesterday, the supply challenge is the big problem, not necessarily in the US, but in the rest of the world. But a lot comes back to trust in various forms. And it's those forms that we're digging into a little bit via this research. But also digging into this idea of what role does Digital Product Passport play? And you know, we're dealing with a lot of the companies within the circular supply chain, and I can say that Apkudo are kind of seizing on this opportunity and this theme much earlier than other companies are. You know, Digital Product Passport isn't a new topic necessarily. EU regulation has made it relevant, but companies are kind of seizing on it to try and understand it. And I would say from where we sit, Apkudo are absolutely leading the way in terms of trying to understand you know, what drives trust, what creates friction in the consumer journey and perceptions of DPP. So that's really what we've been trying to do. So starting with the research scope, and again, I know those words will be a bit small for you, but Kristen has said that you're going to receive all these slides, so you can dive into the content after the event. But really, when we sat down with Kristen, we have our event called Circular Markets, which was in London earlier this year, and we did a great workshop with Apkudo and GSMA on the topic of Digital Product Passport. Lots of interest in that session, a packed room, and we've kind of come away from that and got a great brief from Kristen saying, look, we really want to focus on a few key areas. And that first area was this idea of a confusion tax. What is it costing the industry from consumers really not knowing what the hell they're buying or who they're buying from and so on? What is the actual cost of that? And understanding things like, what does like new mean, or a grade A or a grade B, and how that confusion affects their decision making and fundamentally the money they're spending on refurb devices. The second aspect was validating this concept, or introducing this concept of a device product passport to consumers and seeing what their reaction is, seeing if it's positive or negative or indifferent. And third, it's this idea of a validation layer. So, you know, what components of a digital product passport might make it more valuable from a consumer perspective. From a methodology perspective, this was the first phase of a two-part project, and it was a qualitative phase. So we did focus groups, and I mentioned 2 weeks ago on the Thursday and the Friday in the US and UK. They were online, which is very, very effective. 90-minute focus groups with a very experienced moderator that at FDM CCS Insight we've worked with for a number of years now. And we were speaking to people who have either purchased a refurbished device or are open to purchasing a refurbished device. So you had kind of people who've already purchased and people who would be open to the idea of buying a refurbished device. So they are, if you like, actual opportunity for this market. So I mentioned this is phase one, and the reason we do a qual phase before a quantitative phase is you're kind of just opening it up. You're throwing things at people in a focus group and you see what comes back. You know, the value of a qualitative phase is you find out things that, as the research designer, you you wouldn't be expecting, right? But it doesn't give you statistical significance, right? So the findings we've got here, some of them feel quite conclusive, but it's still not statistically relevant. What we would do now as the second phase is kind of hone in on some of those themes, create a structured questionnaire, and then say, you know what? 80% of people absolutely need a digital product passport when they're buying their refurbished device. So that's the idea of doing a two-stage phase or two-phased approach when we were doing this. So the first thing we looked at is this idea of the confusion tax. So do consumers, at a very, very sort of basic high level, we'll kind of get into a bit more detail as we go through this, but do consumers actually understand the difference between a used and a refurbished device? And I think it's an interesting question because actually it came up with Daniel when we had the session yesterday. The industry itself is an absolute mess. You know, if you go to somebody and say, so what is a certified pre-owned, from when Samsung created the idea and then it's been made a mockery of by lots of other companies. But what is a refurbished device? What is a used device? It came out in the panel yesterday. As an industry, we don't actually really know. So the question is, do consumers know? Without the statistical significance, it was still quite a good finding, quite a clear finding, that yes, broadly, the people in those 4 different focus groups generally understood the idea that a used device has unknown history and it comes with a fair degree of risk. Whereas a refurbished device comes with testing, repair, some level of assurance that something's happened to this device and that therefore is less risk for you at the consumer level. So at a high level, the category structure is understood and it works. But you know, the important bit is then when you dig a little bit deeper and you start saying, okay, let's just focus on refurbished devices, that's where you see that there is a fair degree of uncertainty about what that actually means. So when we go deeper, that's where we start to see a little bit of anxiety in the room about, or the virtual room, about what some of these things mean. And it was clear, unprompted, that there are 4 major perceived risks with consumers. And I think some of these things, as the industry, you say, yeah, okay, that kind of makes sense. But again, this is an unprompted focus group, and this is what consumers are telling us. And the key thing is, when they're buying a like new or a grade A or whatever, they don't have this information. So this is kind of, you know, beyond what they are usually seeing when they're buying a refurbished device. And they're coming to us and saying, battery health is absolutely the most important. And interestingly, they're not associating it as the component, they're associating it as the device. It's kind of one and the same. You know, is a refurbished device going to work for me? Fundamentally, it comes down to battery life. And that's sort of unprompted views from 4 focus groups. The quality of repairs and parts. There's some interesting dynamics with that, which I'll come on to a little bit later. Post-warranty failure, hidden issues that might emerge after the warranty period is ended, and just that trust factor of, will this device last as long as my new device lasted? They just don't know. And another thing that came out quite strongly from this research is channel trust. Where you buy matters easily as much as what you are buying as the device. So, you know, even though refurbished devices are seen as processed or managed by the industry and therefore much lesser risk than buying a used device, there are still perceived risks inherent in that process. And again, this is coming out from consumers with some really nice quotes there that I'm not going to go through all of those, but you'll have those. And by the way, that's the other aspect, I think, of a qual research approach. You find out the things that you didn't necessarily knew you were looking for, but you get some great quotes, you know. And if this ever does turn into a white paper or whatever, from the horse's mouth, this is people expressing their views that's very powerful, that a quant survey can never really do or achieve. So, you know, what matters to consumers? It's absolutely battery health and warranty terms as the top 2, and not statistically relevant, but of the group, more than 90% of respondents said that they are absolutely the most important. Then it comes down to condition grading and the returns policy that's being offered. And then finally, refurbishment detail and the retailer trust. But I think the key takeaway here is that, which was another really interesting dynamic I came away with from yesterday, that consumers are not asking for everything. You know, they're certainly not asking for all the unbelievable amounts of information I was seeing yesterday through, in terms of what we're talking about, digital product passport, they're looking for specific, high confidence signals to make their decision. You know, you kind of think when you're buying a car, you know, what are the top 4 or 5 things that everybody's looking at? It's brand, it's a model, it's age, it's mileage, and so on. And what we're getting to is this is what consumers want to know. And you know, if you get the battery information right, if you get the warranty information right, then that addresses a significant portion of the risk. Another theme that kind of came out that I mentioned yesterday is the more information you give people, then they might want more information. You know, we're talking about parts. If you give people information about parts, then they might say, oh, actually, yeah, now I am interested. I do want a Samsung part as opposed to a third-party part. But at this stage, without access to that information, by and large, those 2 factors are by far the most important. But again, this made me think following yesterday, and it's about digital product passport designed for the industry versus designed for consumers. And clearly they're 2 very different use cases based off the same device product passport. And that might be a known thing, but I do think when we think about the grading discussion and CTIA and the fantastic work that CTIA has done, that's come from a kind of B2B development area, and now it's being made, or trying to be made relevant for the consumer area. And there's a challenge with that sometimes. And, you know, and other companies are sort of saying, let's create a grading solution from the consumer perspective and make it relevant to the industry. But you know, I think that the interesting discussion about DPP here is consumers want to keep it really simple. Clearly, the industry needs vast amounts of other information that was on display very impressively through yesterday's sessions. So, you know, going on the topic of grading, you know, we're getting to the central theme of confusion tax. Consumers are familiar with grading terms like fair, good, excellent, and so on, and say, yeah, we get that. That's absolutely fine. But you know, what really came out strongly is that they don't necessarily trust or understand what those terms mean, depending on where they're buying, who they're buying from, and so on. They recognize as consumers that those definitions are inconsistent if you're going from one retailer to another. So the labels inherit the trust level of the seller, not their intrinsic meaning. You know, good or not even good. You know, if you get to sort of fair or whatever, people are just like, I have no idea what that means. Really, you know, if I'm buying fair from one player, I'm really going to associate it with the player, the retailer, not necessarily what those words mean. It doesn't mean anything. So excellent doesn't mean a fixed standard. It really means whatever the retailer or the carrier's reputation implies that should be. And that's a big, I think, structural challenge in the market that favors the big brands, maybe not the smaller brands as a retailer. So the impact of that confusion, that's where you start to see the real commercial consequences. And we're not at the stage, until we've done the quant survey, of being able to put a figure on it. But when we get to the next stage, we will be able to say, you know, in theory, based on what consumers have told us and our measurement of consumers and what they might pay or not pay, you'll get an idea of what is the consumer tax, what is the industry, or the confusion tax, what is the industry losing because of this factor. But what you see from the focus groups is people saying they're going to delay purchase. People hesitate or wait because they don't know what they're buying, or they feel they have to shop around a lot more and they hesitate in buying. All of this stuff, by the way, if you're buying new devices, it just doesn't exist. This is all a tax on the industry. Trade-up behavior. Consumers pay more to reduce the uncertainty. Okay, so maybe that mitigates the tax. People are paying more, so maybe that's helping the industry. They're switching to new devices. It's good for Samsung and Apple, but not for this industry, not for the refurbished industry. So what they're saying to us, when the risk outweighs the savings, they're just going to say, you know what, I'm just going to go and buy a new device. And then channel switching is the other theme. They move to retailers they trust more because they don't fundamentally trust the information that they're giving. But one important point stands out here, I think, is that consumers are often spending more not for the quality, but for certainty. They want that certainty, and that plays in to the value of digital product passport. So yeah, fundamentally, the essence of what we're talking about is this is distorting what people buy, when they're buying it, where they're buying it from, and fundamentally the amount that they are prepared to pay. So now we get into the core of the session, and you know what? This was This was by far, I'd say, the strongest finding in terms of the strength of views among the group. Across both groups, US and UK, every respondent saw value in the concept of a digital product passport. And you can see here we've kind of got a mock-up of a Samsung digital product passport that we presented to them in the groups, and we talked it through with them, and there was a resounding, yeah, this is amazing. And I'll share some of the quotes with you because maybe that's a bit hard to read. But they loved the fact that it was transparent, much more transparent than, oh, okay, fair, what the hell does that mean? It showed that the retailer, they said, had confidence in what they were selling because they were sharing all this detail. And it provides that decision-making clarity. You know, you're not looking at, okay, that's a grade B, it's photos, what am I looking at here? But you can make some decision-making processes around that information. But in several cases, respondents said they would now hesitate to buy without something like that now that they'd seen it. So it's not just a nice to have, it is a category standard. And for this one, I will read out some of the quotes. So the first one up there, showing all these details up front, highlight that the retailer is confident about their products, which makes it more trustworthy for me. This makes me more likely to purchase a refurbished phone. As someone who is a little bit nervous about buying refurbished, this has all the information I need. The device passport is the most important thing for me. I would not want to buy a phone without it now. It's valuable to have a professional appraisal of the product. It also differentiates professionals from regular sellers. So, you know, if that's the intention of what DTPP is doing, based on the 24 people in those groups, it was a pretty resounding response. Another interesting one, which we've kept in, is it kind of surprised us a little bit, but again, that's the value of this kind of format or this kind of methodology. There was a kind of skepticism or a little bit nervousness about this idea of AI-led robotics over manual. Now, again, this is not statistically relevant, and it could be that when we get to the quant survey, it shows something different. But I think, you know, Kristen was very happy that we kept this in there because I think it does create an industry discussion around how do we communicate. Because as an industry, we know the way this industry is moving forward is with robotics. There's no question about that for efficiency, accuracy, all the things we know about. And it could be that in the communication, it never needs to be mentioned whether it's people or robots involved. But there is this skepticism that came out. And it could be like with cars. If you said to somebody, okay, we're going to have a robot look at your car or you're a qualified mechanic, they would say, oh, well, I want a qualified mechanic. Anyway, it's a kind of point around communicating the benefits that as an industry, it's very clear the move towards robotics. And by the way, it could be skepticism about AI as opposed to the robotics here, I think. So feedback on the passport content. The breadth of information that we shared with them was very well received. They said that's kind of got everything that we want. But there were a few areas where they said we want a bit of improvement. We want a bit more information here. One is the verifiability of the information that's being received. It's like, well, you know, who's actually put that information in there. The transparency around the thresholds. You know, this idea of a green tick. What does a green tick actually mean? And again, that came up in all the sessions yesterday, that there's these thresholds, and as a business, your customers, Apkudo's customers, can kind of say, well, we want our threshold to be here. But consumers might be saying, well, what does that threshold actually mean as a green tick? And supporting evidence as well, such as images, warranties, returns policy, and so on. So the concept works, but the credibility and clarity are important alongside that. From a willingness to pay perspective, in the group, people said that maybe they'd be prepared to pay $20 or 20 British pounds at most to get access to that information. But I think importantly, people were saying the passport should just be standard with the device, and there shouldn't be an add-on cost. But what was important is, even if they wouldn't pay explicitly, it would drive their retailer choice and it would drive their conversion to buy a device. So there is a real commercial point here to what they're getting. Even if, as a cost item, they would say they wouldn't buy. And to be honest, in consumer research, if you ever say to people, what are you prepared to pay for this? Invariably, they kind of say, nah, not so sure. But I think it's valid what they're saying here, that they feel it should be part of the proposition when they're buying. Oops, have I gone back to... So what matters most in the passport? Very clearly, functional testing, top. Battery health, very important. They are must-haves as far as everybody's concerned. But interestingly, the parts history is less important. But again, it was the point I made yesterday in this theme about when you give people information, they start making decisions on things that actually weren't important to them before. When we put it to them, what's important? Parts history, no, not fussed. When you put it to them, okay, so do you want a Samsung Apple part or do you want a non-genuine part? Oh, it has to be Samsung Apple, which is kind of interesting because then suddenly all those devices that before you gave them the information were just as valuable because it came from the same retailer, it had a digital product passport. Hey, yeah, that's just as good. But then when you give them the information, then suddenly something is less valuable than others, which plays very well for Samsung and Apple, maybe not for third-party alternatives. But maybe there is an opportunity to think about trusted certification for non-genuine parts as well, but that's a whole other discussion. And then the final theme that we looked at is this idea of a verification layer. And it was very clear that branding, especially manufacturer branding, is a very, very powerful trust signal. But one key insight is that when forced to choose, consumers prefer the device passport to just a branded badge. Okay, so, and that's important. They're saying if I can have all the detailed information, that's important, more important than having an OEM badge on there. So the badge they see as a signal, the passport they see as the evidence, but the ideal solution is absolutely combining both. So if you've got a passport and it's got detailed transparency and you've got the recognizable validation, they're super happy. And they're saying that adds a ton of value for us because if you've got a passport and there's brands that we don't recognize, they didn't get that idea. So I think, have I gone too far here? Oh, sorry, did I? Sorry, I wasn't showing you the right screen. You couldn't read anyway, probably. So yeah, just finally, I guess to close up, you'll receive all the slides, and if you want to come back with questions via Kristen or whatever, you're welcome to. The three takeaways from our perspective is confusion is costing the market. When we do the second phase, we'll be able to kind of put some numbers on that. But it is costing the market because people are deferring their purchase, they're trading up, they're buying new if they don't fundamentally know what they're going to be buying. And there's lost sales. It's as simple as that. Trust is driven by specific transparent information that the DPP will provide, and we got some good feedback on really what is important. And the device passport has the potential to redefine the category and moving this industry from where it is unorganized, messy in various parts of the supply chain. And this is more from a consumer perspective, but we talked yesterday about the impact as well on a kind of a trade level as well. But really, this is about moving this market from a kind of risk-managed purchase to confident choices for consumers. And again, it's not conclusive at this stage until we've done a next stage, but based on this, I think it was a pretty resounding viewpoint that we got from that research. Thanks very much.